All right, so you decided to start a podcast. You came up with your minimum plan to launching your podcast. You clearly defined the whys for your podcast. You came up with the episode flow. You came up with the title, description, and artwork. You have the essential hardware for your podcast. You have the essential software to run your podcast. You came up with your introduction episode, and now it's time to prepare for launching your podcast. Before we jump into it, I want to talk about a guest I had on my podcast. His name is Mark Metry from the Humans 2.0 podcast. And when he started his podcast, he would just haphazardly post episodes. He'd post one a week, roughly. Maybe it's 2 in 1 week, and maybe it skipped the next week. He just sort of posted episodes as they came. And over time, he became a little bit more consistent with it. And then maybe about a year and a half into his podcast, he decided, let's go full force into it. He started posting daily episodes. And then he was able to get on the top charts for Apple. A reason a lot of people say you need to have a really powerful launch is because people think that you have to have that powerful launch to get on these top charts. But a lot of people don't know how the analytics works behind that. Maybe there's some value there, but I know for a fact that you can get on these top charts by optimizing later in your journey. So don't overthink this whole podcast launch situation. You don't need a perfect launch where you get tons and tons of downloads right off the bat. You just get your podcast launched, share it, and move on. But let me jump into it. I just wanted to give you that story so you don't feel too much pressure to have a perfect launch. One of the biggest things related to the launch is you want to have more than one episode at launch. You want to have your introduction episode, and then you want to have 2 to 3 episodes, actual normal episodes at launch. That way, when someone comes to your podcast, when you announce it, they're not just seeing your introduction episode with no content. Otherwise, they may listen to the introduction and then go back to their day. And then if you release the content, you can reach out to them. But getting them to come back again is a pretty big ask, and it's hard to get. You want to be in a good position when you launch your podcast for people to hit that subscribe button. And to do that, you need to have your introduction episode and a couple pieces of content so that people can feel a little bit overwhelmed with how much they need to listen to. And it's a reminder that they need to come back, so they're going to hit that subscribe button. The strategy I used is I had my introduction episode, which is about an hour long of a friend interviewing me. And then I had 3 interviews that I did with other people and released all that at once. So I had 4 episodes live when I launched my podcast and announced it. That way, when people come and I push it to my network, people can come listen to an episode, maybe listen to 2 episodes, and see that there's more content there. And they have more of an idea in their mind that more content will come, so they're more likely to hit that subscribe button. Now, if you're trying to be consistent with releasing episodes on your podcast, whether it be once a week, once a day, once a month, I definitely suggest having a couple episodes in the pipeline so that you have some cushion to get things going. Because when you launch a podcast, you're going to want to spend some of your time on announcing the podcast, getting people to listen to it, as opposed to trying to get more guests to interview or create more content for having more episodes. So I suggest having, 5 to 7 to 10 to 15 max-ish episodes. You don't want to have too many. I've talked to people that have had over 90 episodes in the can before launching their podcast. But the main thing is you haven't gotten that feedback yet. You haven't had people listen to it and give you feedback. If you have 90 episodes recorded before launching your podcast and you need to make a change to something because it's not engaging people, what are you going to do with all the episodes? Are you going to be releasing content you know is not going to resonate with people, that's not good content? Or are you going to trash it all? It's a pretty big decision, so don't put yourself in that predicament. Just create enough to give you that cushion, get some feedback, tweak things, and then move on. So for me, I had about 7 episodes in the can. So I had my introduction episode and 3 interviews at launch, and then I had another 4 interviews in the can. So if I release 1 episode a week, that's a month worth of content that I have for my podcast at launch, with having enough content at launch to get people to hit that subscribe button. For me on my podcast, I've had major changes on how I treat my podcast interviews after every about 10 interviews. So after I did 10 interviews, my podcast shifted a lot. After I got to 20 interviews, my podcast shifted a lot again. After I did 30 interviews, my podcast shifted a lot again. So it's constantly evolving. I'm constantly asking for feedback, listening to what people say, and making changes. So don't create too much content where you can't react to what people want. So there's a balance there. Find what works for you based on the frequency that you're doing, how hard it is for you to find guests or to create content, and just come up with a strategy that fits within those guidelines. There's a few small nuances that you'll want to know about before launching your podcast, such as Apple Podcasts has to approve your podcast before you're able to post to it. And that can take roughly 10 days to get approved. So I would suggest going live with your podcast before announcing it. That way you have that cushion of time to get the content onto the platform. You don't want to announce your podcast, send it to everyone in your network, and then find out that it's not an Apple Podcast, which is one of the biggest podcast platforms. And then you lose that opportunity to get people to go check it out. So just make sure that everything gets out there. No one's really going to listen to your podcast if you don't announce it. So don't worry too much about the podcast sitting out there in internet space for a week where no one is listening to it, but people could listen to it. Because you haven't announced it, probably a lot of people are not going to be organically searching and finding your podcast. Put it out there, get it established out in the internet, and then announce it to your community once you know that it's on Apple Podcasts and all the platforms that you care about. Now, if you haven't already up to this point shared with your community, shared with your family and friends that you're creating a podcast, it's definitely time now to tell them you're working on a podcast, you're going to be coming out with it. Start building some momentum, create some affirmations that sort of hold you accountable, but also give you some momentum so that when you do launch the podcast, people can be like, oh yeah, I remember them saying that they were working on it. I'd love to go check it out now, as opposed to, oh wow, this person just came out with the podcast, and have it be a shock to everyone in your community. I think if you build some hype behind it, you'll see that people engage with it a lot better. There's a ton of ideas you could be doing to do the perfect launch. But I think that it's important to not overthink it. Just choose some things that are important to you and then stick to that. Don't do too much here. You can get caught up. I've had people that have had a podcast ready for launch that have not posted it for over 6 months because of them being worried about how they're launching the podcast. So don't get stuck here. Just launch it, get started, keep going. The main thing is just to keep going and share it with the community and tweak it as you go. Now, I'm curious, what are you doing to prepare for your podcast launch? How many episodes are you planning to have in the can before launching? What kind of strategies are you looking to do for launching your podcast? Who are you engaging with? Or do you have any outside of the box ideas that you're using that maybe you want to share? Post in the comments below. Let us know what your strategy is. If you don't have a strategy yet, let us know how you're approaching it. How are you going to come up with your strategy? And then when you do come up with the strategy, maybe come back and leave another comment about what kind of strategy you came up with. It helps other people watching these tutorials to hear some of your ideas. So it's not just all coming from me, because I don't have all the answers here. I don't have the time to go into every idea that comes to mind, but I just wanted to give you enough to get going and get started in launching your podcast. In the next episode in this series, we're going to be talking about the actual launch. So stay tuned for that. Again, as I've mentioned in previous videos in the series, I'm creating this content for you for free, and all I ask for is that you engage. So hit the like button, leave a comment, leave a couple comments, subscribe to the channel, and let me know if this is valuable to you. Let me know what kind of strategies you're planning to use. Maybe follow me on Instagram, or join the newsletter, or join the Discord group and communicate with other content creators. Just engage with me. That's all I'm asking for. Anyway, let's jump into the next video where we're going to be talking about the launch of your podcast. Thanks for tuning in.